this. And in here, what we have here is we're picking up the 2 meg file that we had. So if you look at over here, give me a second. Let me just launch this. This is the sample file we're going to be using today. So we'll open that up. And then what I'm going to do is open up the config file that's related to this so you can see each step along the way. So this is the file config file working with here. We're going to go into our storage account. Come up from that. Go into our storage account from here. Actually, let's keep that open because we come back and revisit that. Come out from here. Go into our storage account. We're going to look for that actual file. So the relationship between the API key and the configuration file, this is how to relate it. So when you create your own GUIDs, that's specific to your line of business, your company, you can create your own GUID so you can make sure that it's secure to some degree. And this is the basic what we call a managed solution. There's a thing called a remote solution where the GUID is automatically generated for you, so you don't have to worry about it, but we're not covering that today. And this is the steps. So by default, this is turned on. We have a couple of steps here. We're converting it from this to string. We're converting it to a JSON. We're writing it to storage account. Some of these things we're going to be doing, but and eventually we're going to write it to a batch file called process container. That's the goal here, right? So if I start from here and I turn everything off, I'll quickly show you how that's going to work. So this is turned off. We're going to turn this off first. And turn this false. So this is why it says the circuit breaker pattern was enabled. You got to keep things off. We're going to turn this we're going to turn this on because we want to maybe see whether it can convert it to JSON. And then what we're going to do is there's a transformation step here we're going to keep off because we don't need that because this is the liquid part, which are not going to be involved in the requests. And this is the final part that actually writes it to our database, but we want to show you the file converted first before we do that. And this is where you can do some validation and testing. So we've deployed it out into environments rather than stepping through your code all the time like we normally do traditionally. You just step through code and test that way. Because it's configuration driven development, we don't have the concept of debugging. So this is how we do validation and testing because everything is configured. So with that, if I go back to my API here and I hit send, if everything works out correctly, sorry, upload file. That's the wrong word. That's the wrong term. Let's try it one more time. We said 4 for not found. Or is receiving response, so it's taking a while. All right, so if you notice that it took that file, that CSV file, and it's the first process of the ETL is extracted it and transferred it into a JSON. So this is the output that we want to get up in our database. So I'm just showing you what it look like, the capability that we have to actually convert it. Now, most of our databases don't understand CSV. So one of the things that we have to do as part of the process is exchange that to put that into our backend database as JSON. So we have that capability to do that, right? So that's just showing one of the capabilities that we have inside of the configuration file. Now, since I have this turned on here, I can actually go back in and make some adjustments. It's okay. I know this works as JSON, so it proves that the data that's coming from the CSV is not corrupt. CSV file is not corrupted, so I can make this false. But the goal here is I want to be able to move this file directly into my as a CSV file because this guy needs to be converted to CSV. So if I save that and I go back here and I hit send again, you might get a different experience. So we're back to the raw format. So this is a raw CSV file, right? So we can see that this is the file that actually transfers to the backend. So just by making one change to the config file, we have a CSV. So now I want to be able to make this true. This guy is asking that he wants it converted into as a stream. So stream is the best way to send data across because it's very performance. So anytime you have an option to take string and convert to stream, I'll recommend doing that because streaming is much more cleaner. Turn this on. Let's go back and run it one more time and see what we get. Great success. So now we have coloration ID. So we get three different experiences. We had the initial experience, which was a JSON. The second experience was coming out as a plain CSV file. The third experience, which we had with the same API because we turned things on, was to get coloration ID that matches. So what does that represent in our database, our backend system? So if we go back here, we close this, we go into our container, and we go into our pickup container and see what's in there. Oh, that's cleaned up behind itself, which is fine. Well, we didn't, not sorry, it's a process container because we haven't done any FTP yet. There's a CSV file here that contains. If we open up this file, I think we talked about how we're dissecting or parsing our files into manageable sizes. So that definition of 200 records, this is how it's represented here. So if we scroll down, we have 201 records minus the header, and that's how messages get moved from point A to point B, right? So with that being said, if we go over here, and then we go into our storage account browser now, we can actually start looking at whether the data made it all the way to our backend system. And we can look at how we made it to our backend system. So there's two tables that we created earlier. One was a CSV batch file table. This actually just tracks all the parsed files and matches. So from a network operating center, if they were trying to look at how many batches were created and what the files names were, this is how the using the network operating center, you have a UI in front of this to see how many files are moving across your system. Oh, we need to click that by mistake. The other thing you can check really quickly is the NoSQL database that we created. You see where they made it there. So if I go back to the tables again, and I hit the training data that we created earlier, if you notice that the data made it all the way here. So this data is created for us. It already has all the schema representations. Now, one thing that you do get as an addition when you use a NoSQL database is, in this case, is I get what I call partition keys, which actually just is a nice clean way of partitioning your data so it's easily queryable. So you have the partition key, row key, and timestamp. Then this data basically is ready to go. So you can go in here, you can click on it, and you can start doing searches inside of here. So now we know that I made it to the NoSQL database. It didn't make it to the SQL database. So we can click on that one and check that. I do have one open here already. Do I have one open? Yeah, I do have this open. So I can come out here. I created this earlier, so I'm going to quit this. Oops. Well, I'm back out of here. Okay, so let's do that. All right, go into the query editor. Let me log in. Then in my tables here, I can just take the first 1000 and see whether there's any records that came back. All right, so I select it and run that. Let's see whether we had any records. So we do have records because we have a schema. So that made it to our NoSQL database. It just proves that we can move data to two separate systems in one shot. And how is that possible for us to do that? Is that let me keep this simple. Is that Service Bus is the guy that's responsible for that, right? So the Service Bus topic allows us to connect to two separate backend systems as consumers. But if we're using a queue, which is basically a one file, one consumer, then you'll be able to do that. The one good thing about using the Service Bus is that it tells you how your data is moving across the system in real time. We just moved, so this is a way of checking. So if you wanted to do some checks and balances after you move your data, you need to understand what touch points you have, what resources are moving the data, how my data is moving, how it's performing. So this is a very good way of doing that. So it tells you it moves 101 files. Each were 200 in size, so you can do the math on that. So around 10,000. If you look at, yeah, it's 50, 100 times 101. Well, it's 51 files, one in each one, so about 10,000. So this is basically how you can tell where your files are moving. Now this will move, once we're moving large loads, you will see this fluctuate, and then you see it hit caps. Microsoft does a very good job telling you when you're hitting those caps, so you can actually grow your server, and then you have a way to store anything that's holding. This is actually a perfect migration because we don't have anything in current size, we have nothing in dead letter, but there's scenarios where we can have things in dead letter. So now this is done, the client is kind of happy, but the one thing that they want to validate as a phase one is to make sure that we can get data back out. And that's what we're going to showcase now. So we have data going in. How do we retrieve that data? So let's use a search here and let's see if we can get some of that data out. So this is, I had a sample in here before. I'm going to change this to this. The header is that one. We can go and look at the documentation to make sure that we're doing the right thing here. Let's find that. And this is searching the NoSQL database. We can actually go in and look at the config file to see what is inside of it. So everything is very visible, right? So if you're using this solution, um, if you feel that there's something, a step is not working, like I mentioned, you can turn it off. And if you introduce a process step that you're not sure how it works, you can test it independently by shutting everything off and just running that particular flow. So this one is just basically going and say, hey, I'm going to search a database to see whether there's any data in there. And then I'm going to retrieve it. But one thing I'm going to do is I'm going to turn some things up because the client might not be interested in seeing the row key or the timestamp. But we're going to walk through that process and see how we can make sure we test each flow independently. So I'll go back to my API here. I think the first thing I'm going to do is to make this more interesting. Let me come over here. I have one of these open. Actually, we don't need that anymore. And I'm opening a lot of windows here, but I want to make this more interesting. We can test it. So we're going to do it. We're going to first test it within Azure before we expose it to make sure we can do some filtering. So I'm going to go back into my storage account here. I'm going to keep that window open as well. So we're going back to our storage account and we're going to filter down to what we're trying to look for and then apply that filter in our API. So we're going to do a simple search. So it's assuming, go back to our table here. We're going to pick one of these guys. Just the first one is fine. And we're just going to filter for uh, universities, California State Universities, we're going to filter for. So we're going to go into filter here. And we're just going to do a simple filter where we're just choosing the company. We notice that the schema is already being chosen for us, so we just don't have to worry about that. Now it's going to filter down for just universities that in California. And if we hit the advanced tab, we're going to just grab the query as is, copy that over, and go into our API. So we're not doing any changes at the moment, just doing straight, almost like you're writing a straight SQL and just coming in here and pasting in here and see whether you can get results set back. So this is, gives you, so we're not tampering with the database, we're just doing a pass through. Hit send. And if everything works correctly, we should get data back. So that came back with data, and this is already in JSON format. So there's no need to map it to anything. This data came back in JSON form. I even noticed um, if I go back to our code base over here, and where I left this open, and I go to our config file, which I think is this one. This is turned on, which is basically going and searching the data, but also this is turned on, is taking out a couple of things. Like if you wanted to expose the true all the values out, because a lot of customers might not want to see some values. This is where the ELT comes in, where you're doing you're extracting, doing some load transformation and loading, right? And in this case, you have to query the data and you do some transformation before you display it. So if you notice that this has a couple of properties that need to be added in. So I do another search now. It's now brought back the partition key, the timestamp, and it was brought that back as well. So you can actually remove fields that you don't care about, that you don't want to expose to the client. So the client might not be interested in a row key who's displaying it, but they want to edit data, or they don't even care about the partition key, has no monetary value to them. They can take it out all the timestamp, or we can pick additional rows in here. That's one of the benefits you have. So that extra step that's inside of the code base allows us to clean it up. In this case, the client just wants to see clean data. And it might be in a scenario where they want to see the timestamp because they want to know how many rows, how many was when these records were placed in the backend system. In this case, I just take out the partition key, I just take out the row key. This is the extra step for do transformation. If you want to do add transformation after the fact, you can go add additional transformation here. But the goal here is I want to be able to pull data back and the client is basically happy. So the next thing, the final step is the doing the secure file transfer, which is the big load. How do we get large loads into our system? We're back into a known state here. we can do the same here. Also, one of the things that we can do is that we can actually query our other database. Remember, I just forgot we had two databases that are provision. This is a NoSQL database that's bringing back data, but we also have a SQL database that is also bringing back data as well. So how do we do that? So we're going to grab the SQL endpoint, which is that guy. We're going to create a database here, paste that in, go into the body. And then here we're going to do, we're just going to do select. Let's go back and actually look at table. So what are making any mistakes here? I don't know what I have to open. I think I have one of them open here. This is it. We're going to do the same thing here. We're going to select the same thing, top 1,000. We're not going to make an adjustment. And I won't recommend doing this for most databases because writing straight SQL through a UI is not recommended. You can parameterize it. We have that capability as well, but we're not going to showcase that today. And then we hit search. Let's see what happens. We have data coming back. So, but this is a different data set. This is actually, if you notice that this doesn't have any partition key or time. This is actually calling a separate SQL database. And this is where this is where we can do validation against two separate database domains. So if you have five of these, you can, but you don't have to change your endpoint. You just have to add new workflows, and then you can change direction on what database you want to talk to and get data back. And you also can actually do your own ETL or ELT all the way back out as well for specific pipelines that you want to pull the data back out. So a client might want data in a different format than what you're seeing here. You can do real-time ETL and just push the data, give them the data out from here. So now I've shown that. Now we want to move big data sets, right? So we want to do the final step here, which is to move data into our backend system using a secure file transfer, which is the client is completely exposed outside. They want to move large loads and they're moving files in maybe they're moving files every 5 minutes. So we want to showcase that. So if we go back to our documentation,